Hello and welcome to the Thinking Fellows podcast. My name is Caleb Keith, and the Thinking Fellows is brought to you by the 1517 Podcast Network of shows. You can go to 1517.org/podcasts to see all of our shows there. Today I am joined by Adam Francisco, Bruce Hillman, and Scott Keith to discuss our topic, which is a question this week. Can you make the gospel relevant? This is a common, I think, position or a common thing I see from, I'm just going to call them American churches in general, which is that the church needs to do a better job of making the gospel relevant in and to people's lives. It's usually positioned as a evangelical sort of issue or an evangelism and missions issue, and then maybe borderline with those two things, apologetics as well, is relevancy part of that. I think there's a short answer to this, and then there's obviously the longer whys. The sub answer to this too is: are there things that churches do inadvertently to try to make the gospel relevant, and what are the limits of changing the style or the look or the feel of your church in regards to the relevancy of the gospel? So whoever wants to take a swing first.
The question behind the question is, should or can Christianity be made relevant? Because the gospel is the gospel, right? Is that what we're kind of is? Should,
yeah,
I
think
is this kind of user seeker friendly kind of question? Is that what we're?
Oh man, yeah,
yeah. Because I hear it in two senses. I hear it in the sense of, is the gospel intrinsically in need of relevance on the one hand, but also, is the Christian witness to the gospel, does that require a certain level of cultural relevance? I can go either way, depending on how the question is phrased.
All I hear when I hear that is going into churches where they attempt to make specifically the gospel relevant by calling it the gospel and turn it into law. And every time I've encountered people that try to make the gospel more relevant, that means making it more something you participate in and you do. It's like, Adam, you've heard this. I'm so sick of hearing the same thing week after week. Can you just tell me something that helps make my life better? Or some things I can do to improve my marriage or society or whatever? And you hear that, and it's either a despising of the gospel or a wanting the gospel to be something it's not, which is the law.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a couple of ways of asking it, but that's the thing I have in mind, which is specifically people who advocate for the gospel to be relevant, piggybacking on what Adam was getting at here with. The gospel is the gospel. So can you change it, change its nature, or change what it is? Yeah, the medium for people. And the answer is no. The gospel is immutable, unchangeable. It's the word of God. It's a particular thing, and changing any of the particulars about that thing make it not the gospel. And St. Paul especially is very, very sensitive to other gospels, right? Throughout his epistles, or modifications to the gospel, or replacing the gospel with the law. And I think just how natural that is to us. And so I think the big question for me is when people today say, well, the problem with Christianity or the Christian witness is that we aren't making the gospel relevant to people's lives, is usually, I think, how you'll hear that phrased. I then hear another gospel, a modification to the true gospel. And so I think that's the question is there a true gospel, an immutable gospel, that can't be altered, i.e. can't be made relevant? And then in light of, if the answer to that is yes, which I think it is, and I would assume you guys do too, the question is then, what can Christians or Orthodox Christianity offer to this particular question or anxiety, which is how what can Christians do in regards to the place they are, the period in time they are, the people they're surrounded by, if you can't modify the gospel?
I think, I don't know if I'm actually agreeing with you or not. I probably am, but as I think about it, I obviously would completely agree that the gospel is immutable, and that intrinsically in the proclamation of the true gospel, because of what the gospel is saying about sin and humanity and the work of Christ on the cross, it is always relevant to the needs of humanity. But to me, that's a different question than should the gospel be made relevant to an audience. And in that case, I think there can be abuses, but my answer would be yes. I mean, there are 4 gospels. Matthew's clearly written to Jews. John is written to a Greek-leaning audience. I mean, you don't need 4 gospels if the answer is just straight no, in my opinion. And so there is a certain sense. You don't need apologetics to me if the answer is just flat out no. There is a sense where the immutable gospel needs to come to me, and I think that's the work of missions, and that includes some sense of engaging with the importance of cultural relevance. I mean, why is the Bible in English and not still in Latin?
That feels like preaching more than the gospel particularly to me, but maybe I'm not trying to be pedantic, but it just feels that way. I think when we're talking about the gospel itself, you're talking about, the life, death, and resurrection of Christ for you, and that message. Now, that message is contained in all 4 of the gospels, because the gospels broadly tell that story, right, of Christ's incarnation and birth, his life, his fulfillment of prophecy, his passion, his death on the cross, his resurrection, his appearing to his disciples after his resurrection, his promise to send the Holy Spirit, his ascension into heaven. They tell that story, which is broadly speaking the gospel, but the gospel itself, as Paul gives it to us in 1 Corinthians 15, kind of the whole chapter in a lot of ways, is the proclamation of that specific thing to sinners. Now, within the Gospels, there's a lot of law and gospel, right? There's a lot of history. There's a lot of narrative. Not everything in the Gospels is specifically gospel, or at least gospel proclamation. And I think there's a lot of setup to preaching. There's sometimes a lot of setup to preaching the gospel, and that includes, convicting people of their sin and their need for Christ and the gospel in that. And that's a lot of what happens. I mean, that's a lot of what happens in the Gospels, is Christ convicting the world, the religious leaders of his time, with the law, and then presenting them their only hope for salvation, which is him, which is specifically the gospel. I don't know how relativized that one message can be. Now, the approach to bringing that message to people, I'm sure, can be, adapted from here to there. What type of message? It can be defended in apologetics when questions arise. But is the thing itself something that I struggle with it being made relevant, because it's the most relevant thing that any of us will ever face. As Dr. Montgomery points out in Sensible Christianity, it answers the one big question that we all will face, and that's our impending death and doom, right? And it's because of that, it's the most relevant thing ever. It's literally the one thing that everybody that's born will die, unless they live till Christ comes again. Everybody that's born will die. And so what happens at that point for you, and is it all going to be okay because of Christ's death and resurrection for you, the forgiveness of sins that he wrought in his death and resurrection for you, the atonement that he bought in his death for you? Is it all, is there hope beyond this world? That's the most relevant thing ever. I don't know how you even make it more relevant. Do you make it more relevant by putting it to a snappy tune? Okay, that's not going to make it more relevant. What made it relevant is that you will face this ultimate problem just like everybody else that's ever been born will face this ultimate problem.
But that, to me, maybe it's semantics, but that's, I guess the distinction I'm trying to make is the distinction between the gospel, rightly as you say, is inherently relative because of what the message proclaims, and then the way that message is given or applied to a person so that they hear the relevance within it. And I think when evangelicals talk about making the gospel relevant, that's actually what they mean. They're talking about the process by which that very inherently relevant message gains a hearing with me.
I do.
Go ahead.
Well, so I
Really?
think my one kind of disagreement with that verse is that I think it actually kind of has to do with the idea is fundamentally about the will and conversion is the gospel a mere opportunity that each person in time has to seize or choose for themselves, and thus the church is prettying up the gospel in whichever way makes it most appealing to the human will to choose and to be attached to and to desire. Versus, is the gospel the power of God to salvation that causes salvation, elects people to salvation, does all of these things? And I think if we confess with Paul and with our tradition that it's the power of salvation, the power to salvation, there is not making it relevant, though it is preached always in time, in space, to particular groups of people from a particular group of people or person, so that it is contextualized and local. So
how is that not making it relevant?
I would steer away from calling that making it relevant, in the sense that the making part. It's that I am just it is being proclaimed in its context, is being proclaimed in its location at its time at its appointed time. It's being proclaimed
strategically with the culture in mind, if you're contextualizing it.
See, I think that the strategy is actually the law. So you're applying it to particular sins and particular conditions.
This is my original point.
So that the gospel would be the immutable part of what you're preaching, and that the changing part or the relevant part is the law, actually.
Yeah.
So I think people think the law is unchanging or is the most unchanging part of Scripture because it's so firm and it's listed and things like that. But it's actually it's written on everybody's heart. The condition of death affects or comes to people in different ways.
Can I give an example? The example that I'm sure Adam is going to give is Paul on the Areopagus, right? He walks up to this group of philosophers and he says, I see you here, you have a statue to an unknown God. Some would say that's relativizing the gospel, right? Actually, that is not relativizing. What are we using?
Contextualizing.
Oh, yeah. Making it relative. Contextualizing.
Making it.
That's actually Paul preaching the law, because what he's about to tell them is that their worship of all their other gods is wrong, right? And that there is only one true God, and that God is Jesus Christ. And that is the preaching of the law to them. He's convicting them of their paganism and of their worship of multiple deities that aren't actually deities and are probably demons. He's giving this over to them, and that's the law. And this was my original point, is that when we say we're trying to make the gospel more relevant, 9 out of 10 times what you're doing is you are finding a way to preach the law in a way that convicts people in a particular point in time, right? A way to preach the law, Machen's Christianity and liberalism, a way to preach the law to his time. We preach the law to our time. We have specific issues in our time that weren't giant issues 150 years ago. Abortion, homosexuality, rampant homosexual marriage, transgenderism. These are things where you can approach the world with the law, with the message of the law, in order to break them, and to make them utterly reliant, and to realize that their only hope for salvation is Christ alone. But that's law proclamation. And when you start making that law proclamation, you say, well, what I'm doing is I'm making the gospel a special message to my time, in my opinion, 9 times out of 10, what you're doing is you're using the word gospel, but you're actually doing something, within the context of the law.
On the flip, I would add on the flip side, that usually when making the gospel relevant is to then say that those things that you just listed as sins are things the church shouldn't focus on in its witness, because we need to actually embrace those people. And if we excessively, say, condemn abortion or these other sexual issues today, that we're not working to make the gospel relevant in the lives of all people, etc. So I do think there's a spectrum of these things, but the part that is unchanging is that the gospel is the death and resurrection of Christ for you for the forgiveness of sins, proclaimed to create and sustain faith, and that God promises to do that through His church in every context. So I think that's where I think we making it relevant is sort of my issue.
Adam,
I see you thinking.
Well, I'm a thinking fellow, so of course.
Every time it's like his thinking fellow's dad joke.
No, I've been. Yeah, I'm thinking Bruce's point about, or he used the word strategy, and I can't remember how you put it, but maybe I think we're all saying the same thing. You all are saying the same thing because I haven't said anything, in a way. But I think behind the surface, superficial disagreements here, it's not like we're going to throw fists and things or throw hands afterwards. We couldn't because we're in. Well, yeah.
As long as they're holy hands.
I'm always down for that.
It maybe, again, it goes back to what's the real question here? Because it probably depends on, Scott, you mentioned that you and I have heard, we kind of grew up in Southern California and or when we were in college, it was all about making the gospel relevant. And it was, in fact, at least in our circles, just behind it is this desire to hear more law,
Yep.
To make it applicable to your life. No, and I'm trying to be as fair and broad-minded as possible. I can imagine in bigger evangelical circles. So I don't want to necessarily admit it, but I will. I dabbled in Calvary Chapel a bit when I was there in Southern California, and I don't know, maybe Scott did too. Actually,
no. I'm smirking at you for having done such a thing.
Yeah,
we're pure of church, Adam.
I've heard people who, of course, never break the 8th commandment say that you're not even a Lutheran, but you're like the staunchest pure Lutheran I've met. But in an evangelical context, because their church life is different, where they're not going to what we would maybe call divine service, where it's like a structured liturgy and it's a good carrier for the gospel. Everything points to the gospel. Their services are, maybe there's a little bit of that, but they're more like expository preaching, where it is about where they're just going verse after verse, and it's the telos. It's not. There's no desire for it to point to forgiveness or absolution, So it's just about it's sort of like what we would do in our Sunday mornings, normally or traditionally, Bible study. So I think it really just does depend on the context. But of course, it's always safe to agree with Scott, but I am going to agree with Scott here that generally when you hear making the gospel relevant, it's actually what happens or what's desired there is more law in some way, shape, or form. But at the same time, Bruce's point about this is just a question about strategy. That's Paul at Mars Hill. He's wanting to get to the gospel. He's using the law in a way that's relevant at that particular place and time. Whereas if he's in the synagogues, like in Thessalonica earlier in chapter 17 back, he starts very differently. He starts from the Torah.
Yes. Yeah, so. And that's why I said if we're just saying preaching or evangelizing, heck, I say that I'm the executive director for 1517. It's no one's going to tell me that I don't think that you can sort of take the overall message of Christianity and try to present it in a way that is accessible and that from top to bottom looks good. That's what we do. But that's not relativizing the gospel, because if in doing that, specifically at 15, 17, anybody ever takes the gospel and turns it into something that it's not nude on its own, that's when it gets shut down. Right? That's when it gets shut down in a talk. That's when it gets shut down in a blog. Podcasts are a little different because they're conversations and all that. But, at the end of the day, when I think of this, listen, I'm becoming a YouTube watcher because I'm hip and modern.
This is remarkable. YouTube, wow. I don't know, what do you call it? Talent.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I'm a YouTuber too.
A YouTuber.
Are you really?
Yes.
That's incredible.
I know.
Do you have a channel?
Well, we do.
But you don't have your own channel. You're not really a YouTuber if you don't have your own channel.
But he's mostly on 30 Minutes in the New Testament channel right now.
Yeah. So I'm a YouTuber, Adam. Thank you.
At age 52, this is awesome.
I know. So, I watch this thing that I'm not going to admit that I watch, but every morning I get my cup of coffee and I watch the same YouTube show. And it on my TV because I'm an old man. The other day I saw, it was like in an Episcopal church. It was one of their bishops had come to preach at a local congregation, and he had scanned the church website, right? And he found something on the website that he found very objectionable because he thought it would turn people away. It would make the gospel for their church less relevant. And that was the word salvation. Is that they referred to salvation in Christ as being sort of the ultimate reason why somebody might come to their church, to hear that word of salvation. And he, in his nice robes, with a beautiful choir sitting behind him, with this great redheaded lady sitting behind him when he said that, making a face like, I felt like it was her last day at that church.
Did he have a wonderful chasuble on too?
He did. He was gorgeous.
Everything was perfectly
he was
liturgical.
a very good looking guy. Well spoken, just making the gospel relevant by literally gutting the gospel. And what did he want to put in its place? He wanted to put in a message of inclusion and everybody's welcome, which I hate to say it, that sounds all nice and good newsy, but that's actually the law. That is actually the law, because anything that is not Christ preached, crucified for the forgiveness of your sins is law. And specifically then, if you make the gospel more relevant by taking out salvation and putting things that we can do to make the world feel more welcome here, that's the law. And that's an extreme sort of hyperbolic example that I just happened to see on my favorite morning TV show on YouTube recently. The examples we had in the 90s were dumber than that. You were going to make the gospel more relevant by having a bigger parking lot. 7 keys to an effective church type stuff. You were going to make the gospel more relevant by making sure that there were greeters in the front, and all of which is maybe great practice. But practice is, say it with me, guys, the law. And this is my point. When you do this, you're not making you may be making church more welcome, which isn't in itself a bad thing. You may be making it easier to access church by making a bigger parking lot. In itself, that's probably a good thing.
Both very good things.
If you can afford it, do it. I mean, we can't afford it, but if you can afford it, do it. All those things are good, but they are not the gospel. They don't make the gospel more relevant. What they make is they make maybe a situation where more people can come hear the unadulterated gospel at your place. That they feel welcome when they get there to hear the unadulterated gospel at your place. But if you attempt to make the gospel more relevant, the gospel itself more relevant, you're going to turn it into something that you do. And then once you've done that, you're now in the realm of the law.
Would you say, or would you be comfortable saying something along the lines of then that the law makes the gospel relevant for a hearing?
I would say the law has a function, right? At the end of the day, now, there are things that are of the law. The law has a function at the end of the day, and is that you are trying to whittle a person down so that they understand that they have only one hope and one means of salvation, and that's in Christ Jesus, right? You're stripping everything off of a person. everything. Now, if this is going to happen in a church, and you say, well, they have to be able to get here, they have to be able to park here, they have to, stay here through the narthex, and maybe that means having a greeter there. They're not going to come back if the seats aren't comfortable and all that. Now, all of that isn't necessarily the whittling down, but because it's specifically something that you are doing, it's the law. At the end of the day, it's part of the law. And that message, this is why sort of making the gospel relevant is kind of a weird thing to say, because the preaching that you would hear on that Sunday morning isn't going to be just the gospel, or it ought not be just the gospel. There will be, if that preaching is Christ-centered preaching, it's going to preach like Christ preached, which is it's going to be very heavy-loaded, convicting law. Again, stripping them down, making them nude, whittling them down till there's nothing left. And then they can come in with the voice of the gospel. Now, you've done a lot of things, right? And by virtue of the fact that I've said done a lot of things, you were in the world of the law. Anytime you're even in doing the civil things in the church, you're in the world of the law. Church council meeting, you're in the world of the law, right?
Isn't the law supposed to condemn me? Doesn't the law bring me death? I don't know how a parking lot does that. I'm just trying to figure out how the category of broad law versus small law.
Well, I can answer how the parking lot still condemns, right? Which is the need is brought out of a guilt that you feel that there is not enough space for people, or that the reality of churches forming committees to build new parking lots puts pressure or accusation on churches that don't do that.
Making sure you have greeters comes out of a guilt that maybe somebody came to you and said, I came to your church, but nobody even said hi to me.
So the law always accuses, but it doesn't only. It's also a first use thing. It's also an order thing. It's also
that's right.
The law is multifaceted. Though if
we're going to go with functions within the first function of the law, just sort of keeping order.
Yeah,
you do all these things. You have committees. You do all these things, and the reality is that is still part of the law, the world of the law. I mean, to me, this is just basic. This is basic like law gospel here. At the end of the day, if it involves you doing,
it's in the legal structure, even if it's not like a theological moment. But I guess my other portion is that there's Paulson will use the phrase all the time, predestination sickness, to describe people's anxiety about seeing the gospel preached and then apparently not seeing everybody who's ever heard it or been exposed to some aspect of it believe. And so then we start asking why.
James' point in handing over the goods too.
We start asking why. And the relevancy part, this is again one of my things, is that the relevancy becomes an answer to that why, or an attempt to answer that why, which is, well, we would see the gospel producing faith if we actually made it relevant. But because we're not making it relevant to people, the gospel isn't working. And so that's my other set of objections, has to do, again, with the anxiety of, seeing people who don't believe and going, what can I do to fix the gospel? What can I do to fix that people aren't believing? And that's not your power. Again, the power to do that is promised from the gospel, not from you. And so, I have no problem with the fact that we are all in a context, proclaiming in a context. But to then say, I'm going to make the gospel more efficacious by making it relevant, or I'm going to finally make the gospel efficacious to a particular group of people to whom it's not because it's not relevant, is the issue. Let
me give you the example of our little church here is a great example. We invite people all the time. I'm going to be very legalistic of myself here and then praise myself in a self-righteous way. We invite people to this church all the stinking time, okay? I've never invited people to church
like I do now.
Like in all my years, I haven't. Now, that could say I was a horrible Christian before and I'm a better one, whatever. Something in there. But we invite people to this church all the time. Now, there's a practical reason for that. It's because there are just very few people here, and it'd sure be nice to have a few more people here, right? If we could go from like a regular 25 to 30 on a Sunday to a regular
45
to 50 on a Sunday, it would be
kind of life-changing.
It'd be great. There'd be more hands to help. There'd be more offering to help, pay the heating bill and to pay our guest preachers and all that. It'd be awesome. And so we've noticed that we get a lot of people to come here and they'll be like, yeah, well, it was nice. And then they don't come back. Right. And so we started asking ourselves, like, okay, what's going on here? Why do we get people to come and they don't come back? Is it just them? Like they're just really not acculturated to doing something on a Sunday morning?
It's not me, it's you situation.
Yeah. Is it us? Is it a combination therein? And we are asking all these questions, so much so that even though we can't really afford it, we put a decent amount of money into this year's budget to try to do something to the space to make it just feel a little less, shall I say, old ladyish. To do something to the space.
Why do you have to gender language, man?
The whole place reminds me of my grandma's house. That's why. So we're doing that, right? We try really hard to make sure somebody's out there to say hello to people and to make people feel welcome. Good news, David Ruffner's great at that. So when he's here on a Sunday, he's out shaking hands, learning names, the whole 9 yards, and
that's why they're not coming back. It's Ruffner.
Well, wow. I just tried to give him a compliment. We do all these things, but that isn't making the gospel relevant. That's just trying to figure out, is there something here that is, like Montgomery again would say in Sensible Christianity, is a roadblock that we can remove. Now, removing that roadblock is not the gospel, right? That's going to be in the realm of the law, to be honest with you. Even when most apologetics that you do, even if you're sort of trying to convince people of the reliability of the New Testament documents, right? That's all great stuff to do, but it's likely, if you think about it, in the realm of the law, because you are
correcting errors.
You're correcting errors. You're trying to convince them of their erroneous thinking on these things. Once you do that, what is the first thing that you're going to do? You're going to teach them that those New Testament 4 Gospels that you've hopefully convinced them are reliable. The first thing you're going to say it teaches them is that they are a sinner in need of a Savior. Right? You're going to go actually right to the law, right to the explicit preaching of the law in that. And then when you give them the gospel, it's going to be completely, hopefully, unadulterated. Christ for you for the forgiveness of sins.
I don't disagree. I guess to use your metaphor and extend it the way I'm thinking about it, because maybe we are just semantically thinking about this differently, as Adam was suggesting. Because let's imagine we're in a tunnel, right? And around there, it has a bend at the end, and it's sunny outside, but I'm essentially blind inside the tunnel. It's completely dark. And I'm kind of mixing Plato's cave here with some evangelism, so this could be dangerous. But anyway, to use your roadblock metaphor, someone comes to me in this tunnel, right? And in this case, they're an evangelist. They're the person who wants me to hear the gospel. They want the light. They want me to see the light, so to speak. And the power's all in the light for me to see. That person can't make me see. We're both blind in that tunnel, so to speak. But there's these roadblocks stopping me from getting to that corner where I could turn and then finally, the light by its own power would give me eyes to see. To me, if I'm removing those roadblocks, we could call that law. I guess I don't have an issue with that. But in a way, that makes the exterior immutable message of the gospel relevant to me because I can't see it until I have access to it. And I can only have access to it if you lead me to where its power can be given a hearing, or in this case, where the light can actually hit my eyes and make me see. So I get nervous. You get nervous, I think. I don't want to speak for you, but you get nervous when the gospel gets corrupted by turning it into law and all these other things that people turn it into, and I would share that. But in my anecdotal experience is different. My anecdotal experience is that the gospel can be that churches can defend not thinking through how they are presenting the gospel at all, in such a way that it's just like, hey, if you just come to church and you just listen to the preacher, it doesn't matter. Everything's going to just work. And so to me, there's another category here that I work with that is incarnational. Christ's incarnation is not a law thing to me. Christ, it's a contextualization invitation in a way to me. Be like Christ and be incarnate. And that incarnation is the way that Christ helps us see himself, as Hebrews says. So I'm just
That's funny.
reading it through that rubric as well.
I mean, I don't disagree with much of what you said other than that calling be like Christ the gospel, because that is specifically a proclamation of the law, one that you will not attain, and one that when I tell it to you, the hope is that you
sanctification by grace.
My hope is that you realize that you're not like Christ, and that once you break down that I present to you Christ for you.
But I am like Christ in my sanctification.
Yeah, you obtain it by the gospel, but it isn't the gospel to say be like Christ, to proclaim be like Christ to somebody's law. That fulfillment is obtained through the accomplished sanctification that the Holy Spirit brings through the gospel.
To me, mostly where this sits, maybe I'm thinking about it too narrowly, but in the realm of evangelism, are there things that you need to do or that you should think about doing to understand where that person's coming from and to try to, approach them in a way that makes it so that they are at least a little more willing to hear what you have to say than if you didn't take that into account. Yeah, I mean, this is I feel like Rod bringing up sensible Christianity 3 times, but this is one of the things that Montgomery says at the beginning of that, is that this is the thing. But what he never says is that in doing that, what you're doing is you're contextualizing the gospel, because he was smart enough at the end of the day to know that would have been a confusion of law and gospel. What you are doing is you're saying, I'm a preacher, I'm an evangelist, I'm an apologist. There are people out there who need to hear this word, and what can I do that, as Adam brought up, that is like what Paul did, to when I first approach them, give them an approach that sort of like when you're writing an essay or a book, has a hook at the front, or relates to them on a particular level. Now, when you take that into sort of the church setting, can you do that in the church setting too, or in a non-church sort of ministry setting like 1517? Yeah, you can, but it's not even debatable, to be honest with. Well, I guess we can debate it. I don't mean it that way, but it's just a reality that an attempt that there have been many attempts to try to make the gospel more appealing to the current generation over the last 30 years that has done nothing but turn the gospel into law. That is just absolute reality. Like this is why you have liberal Christianity. This is why you have neo-Orthodox Christianity. This is why you have legalist Christianity. This is why you have pietist Christianity.
So like progressive.
This is why you have progressive Christianity and social justice Christianity and critical theory Christianity. All of these are an attempt to do just that at the end of the day, take the gospel, make it not the gospel anymore, and turn it into the law. And that is dangerous. Like, that is dangerous to the gospel and to the preaching of the gospel. That doesn't mean that you can't, again, like us, what can we do to the building? Or can we put somebody out front? Or do we need to restripe the parking lot because no one knows where to park?
What I've had a grin on my face, though you might not be able to tell it because the left side of my face doesn't work. But it's interesting to me, and I'm not 100% for sure on this, but I'm pretty confident that the whole question about contextualization emerged in, and this is going to get fancy here, missiological literature, like the theologians who study strategy of missions, and in particular, missiological literature addressing the question, how do Christians operate in Muslim-majority lands where, like, any sort of public display of Christianity can get you, deported, or on the other end of the spectrum, executed. And, the questions, there are layers to contextualization in all that literature. and all the debates among missionaries and how to communicate the gospel in a culture that is like extremely hostile towards the gospel. No offense to our Islamophiles that might be listening, but and there are layers to this. Like it started off with like, well, one thing you absolutely can do that would be helpful in at least gaining a hearing for the gospel or a platform for the gospel is like, don't do stuff that makes you stick out. Don't wear, if you're a lady working at a soup kitchen or a battered woman's house, don't walk around with a halter top and yoga pants, Lululemon outfits or something like that. Like things like that. And then it gets deeper. It's like, then the question was posed. I think this is like layer 4 of contextualization. Can you go so far to be relevant to a Muslim majority context that your church or wherever you meet for Christian worship looks like a mosque, that your service actually looks like a prayer service at a salat prayer service at the mosque, where you're prostrating yourself. Should you refer to yourself as a Muslim follower of Jesus? These sorts of things. And there's all sorts of debates over this. But what's interesting here, at least for me, is how this is now a question, and it's been a question, though we've not, I don't think Christians have talked about it that much, for America. So-called Christian America. And so I think those same sort of debates that you see among Muslims and how far they're willing to go to escape the surveillance of Muslim majority society or to not pose an undue offense to Muslim society. I don't know that this thing can, when it comes to like striping the parking lot and things like that, that seems like small fry stuff. And I do think it gets, it can though, however, like Scott was saying, if you apply let's say we're like looking at this through like a law gospel, like a super Waltherian type of, that might be the lens, the stuff that Walther was I don't know, how would you put it, Scott? Like not just a specialist, but this was his world, his law gospel analysis of everything. Yeah. When you make it sort of a must do or should do for the sake of the gospel, then you do turn it into law. But one thing I'm wondering about, is there just like a third category? Like striping a parking lot?
About.
It's just like first article kind of stuff, isn't it?
Yeah, but that's demand. That's in the world of the law.
I don't see why that makes it bad. This is like not saying law bad. It's just saying in order for a church, like I think a church has to do those things. When you gather together as an organization, as a group of people, you have grounds to take care of. You have a piece of property you purchased, and there's all sorts of things one is obligated or the demands of their neighbor place on them to do. So vocationally, as a church, as a place for the community to hear the gospel, there are demands on you to do certain things like keep your church building clean, maybe redecorate, maybe paint the thing. I just think those are law demands on those people who have gathered there. Now, all of those are working. God uses those demands and calls from the neighbor to bring people together for the proclamation of the gospel. Like I guess that's the thing for me is never saying that the law is bad or isn't a particular work that God is always using to accomplish things, i.e. the needs of my neighbors fulfilled by the demand of the law placed on me. Just like there's a demand of the law placed on me to feed my children, there's a demand on the law placed on me to open these church doors on Sunday morning. I come here early and unlock that. That is the law. It is the law working to push me to making a space
in service of the gospel. Yeah.
The law has always been for the purpose of the gospel. Yeah. It's never been for the purpose of salvation or righteousness. And so I don't see this as a bad thing. I see it as a distinction, and I think it's helpful, especially when I hear the word relativize or relevant and avoiding that when it comes to the gospel, I don't think is just semantic. I think that the words matter in this case, and that relevant implies a need to change, and that the gospel has no need to change. I do think that the demands of the law are relativized in each of our lives, i.e. written on our hearts, i.e. we have different specific vocations that are then relevant, and that those demands change and have changed throughout human history, but changed insofar as they are in accord with the eternal law of God and the internal will of God to have certain things accomplished and fulfilled. And so I just think it's not just semantic, it's a careful distinction between law and gospel to say, I'm all about doing the right things at the right time, having explicit demands on specific people at specific places, but that making the gospel something new, making the gospel something shiny, making the gospel something here and now is not what the gospel is. Well, the gospel is a very, very narrow, specific thing that cannot be altered. Again, the power of salvation proclaimed through the death and resurrection of Christ for you. Outside of that, nothing is the gospel.
Anytime you have a conversation about the gospel and somebody says it's just semantics, hold on to your hat, because we just had a conversation about the law.
Now, when it comes to relevant and just being semantics, I just think it's a word that implies change. And so I can't attach it to the gospel.
Yeah.
I can't attach it to other things. And I'm willing to say churches or something who contextualize, i.e.
attach it to congregational life.
Yeah, but that it's, if it creeps into the gospel portion or what the church is going to call the gospel or the presentation of the gospel, I now have a problem. And so,
because it's going to come into your preaching,
it's a very thin line. It's just a very thin line for me, and I think that's the whole point of distinguishing the law from the gospel.
Yes.
Is that it is a very thin and close line, and
yes.
that when people cross it, even if it seems tiny, that they've crossed it, and it's needed to be called out. And if that's not the case, like the Reformation was somewhat silly.
This happens all the time within our body right now, where our friends who lean very heavily on third function of the law preaching, I think they're smart enough to not say that it's gospel, but they'll equivocate it to being as important as preaching the gospel.
Or say that it's being made to make the church relevant to people.
Yeah, or to my particular congregation or things like that. And it's just,
I think we agree in content.
My only point is that this is the gospel is specifically about preaching,
okay, good.
About preaching here. And can you, at the end of the day, I think in the text of Scripture, I think as you put it, anecdotal experience, when people attempt to make the gospel relative or to change it into something that is, different than what it inherently is, as the power of God into salvation, it always turns it into the law. This is why Paul says, beware of those preaching other gospels. Like, the fact that I've made my church look better and more appealing is good news. But it's not the gospel. It is another gospel.
We've gone back and forth because I think Caleb just hit it on for me. Is I think the whole law gospel thing that we've been talking about, I don't disagree with her. I think we're pretty much all on the same page. I guess my difference is I don't necessarily think that the word relevant must imply change. I think it can, but I don't think it has to. And so that's where the semantics is for me, is just how you would define relevant. Because I don't think relevant has to infer change, and maybe that's where I was kind of hearing it in a wider way than you're thinking about it, which you hear the word relevance in a narrower way than I do.
It happens all over the spectrum, right? So when I wrote an article last month about, people leaving for Eastern Orthodoxy. Well, is the question to Protestant churches then to make the gospel relevant by making the churches look like Eastern Orthodox churches or adopting a higher liturgy or something like that? Again, part of this is always our anxiety about our church or our proclamation not producing what we think it should produce. And then we ask, should we change it? And I think even in those cases, you just have to be careful about how fast you change, or that your desire, is it like jealousy or coveting what your neighbor has and then justified by, well, it's just expanding the preaching of the gospel. And I just think there's a lot of questions about that, or even cautions, not just questions, cautions I would have about that for people, even for our church here, right? Are we grasping at straws by saying, like, if we do X, Y, and Z,
you should wrestle with that.
Change it. Yeah, I think you just have to have caution, wrestle with, are we saying the gospel isn't effective here because our carpets are the wrong color?
Yeah, we should wrestle with that.
And at least then say, no, we want to just improve the life of this congregation. The carpets are ugly for us, in addition to whoever's here, it's not about the power of the gospel.
Yeah.
And so that kind of caution is all I would be advocating for, and careful with words like relevant or contextualizing, because so often they really are what Adam and my dad here described, which is a blatant example of turning the gospel into the law.
And I will say the likely reason why fewer people come back than don't, whatever, most of these people, this is probably the first time they've ever heard an unadulterated proclamation of pure law and gospel, even if they've gone to church, because what we do focus on here is making sure, even though we don't have a full-time preacher, on getting preachers who can do that, and who do that, and who do feel that they need to do that, or believe that they need to do that. That is likely what is hard for people, more than carpet color, which is it's horrible. The carpet color is horrible.
I've got a better example than carpet color and lines in a parking lot. Back to my Calvary Chapel sort of experience. I used to go to a place called Surfers Chapel.
Yeah, baby.
And it was purposely, they were trying to make things relevant by having church on Saturday night, where the pastor would stand before on the pulpit or lectern or whatever was basically the half of a surfboard, and had a little table in the back, and they would have services on Saturday night so that, after dark when you can't surf, so that Sunday morning
you go surfing on Sunday morning,
go surfing. And I mean, in a way, of course, I don't care anymore, but I was like, oh, that's not a bad idea. But I was like, how interesting is this, that your worship has a secondary priority over
your
when
desires.
You surf. But I didn't think about that at that time. Yeah. But that's where the sort of relevancy I think you're right, Scott, that this is not just semantics. It's not just a superficial thing. I think it can be, if you're not careful, a little, not us, I'm speaking broadly, kind of overthought perhaps, but at the same time, it's like Caleb used a term a while back that I've been kind of, I think the technical term is noodling over in my mind, doing a self-audit. And we're not talking like the Scientology type of auditing. We're talking about auditing our language, and how we talk about things. So I think it is important to reflect on, when we use terms like I hadn't even thought when you asked the question initially, making the gospel relevant, are we talking change, all those sort of things that go with it. So the gospel, I think the takeaways here, if we have to have takeaways, you didn't even give me this task, Caleb, but is that the gospel is always relevant and it is unchanging. It's one thing, it's like, but everything around it that points to it, that clears the air or makes one know that they need the gospel. That doesn't necessarily change, but at the same time, the person bringing the gospel knows that those contexts do change. And so the law preached there will be, and pastors and missionaries or people who are located in those communities know best on how to, or are in the better position to apply the law appropriately so that the gospel can be, and its necessity is pronounced or proclaimed loud and clear.
All right. Let's end there before we get in more trouble.
Thank you, Adam, very much for that summary. We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Thinking Fellows podcast. Do not forget to check out the show notes below the description of this episode. There are links in there that we update regularly from 1517 that include directions to various blogs, videos, other podcasts on the 1517 Podcast Network, new books that are out, and all sorts of things like that. Go ahead, check out those show notes. We appreciate your time. We will catch you next week. Bye.